A glass raised in celebration. A hushed, exclusive restaurant filled with the city's elite. At the center of it all, tech billionaire Colton Waverley toasts his beautiful, ambitious protégé, promising her the world. He thinks he's on top of that world, untouchable, finally shedding his old life for a new one. What he doesn't know is that his old life is standing right outside the door. And she's not coming to plead or to cry. She's 7 months pregnant, holding a legal document that's about to turn his billion-dollar empire into her personal revenge fund. Stay tuned, because this isn't just a breakup. It's a hostile takeover. The restaurant L'Étoile Filante was less a place to eat and more a temple dedicated to the worship of wealth. Perched 60 floors above the glittering expanse of Manhattan, its floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city like a living work of art. The air inside was thick with the scent of truffle oil, expensive perfume, and the low, confident hum of power. Conversations were murmurs. Laughter was restrained, and the clinking of cutlery against porcelain was the room's primary soundtrack. It was a place for deals to be sealed, for dynasties to dine, and for secrets to be kept. Tonight, however, a secret was about to be spectacularly broken. At the best table in the house, a semi-private alcove with an unparalleled view of the Hudson River, sat Colton Waverley. At 45, Colton was the very picture of modern success. His hair was a distinguished salt and pepper. His suit was a bespoke Tom Ford that probably cost more than the waiter's car, and his smile was a carefully calibrated instrument of charm and command. He was the founder and CEO of Ethereum Dynamics, a tech behemoth on the verge of an IPO that was projected to triple his already considerable net worth. Across from him sat Cassandra Cassie Lang. At 26, she was all sharp angles and hungry ambition. Her raven hair cut in a severe, stylish bob that framed a face of stunning, almost predatory beauty. She was his senior vice president of strategic growth, a title Colton had created for her. She had climbed the corporate ladder at Ethereum with a speed that had left her colleagues breathless and suspicious. Her eyes fixed on Colton shone with an adoration that was part love, part ambition, and part victory. "I still can't believe this is real," Cassie said, her voice a low purr. She ran a perfectly manicured finger around the rim of her champagne flute. The diamond on her other hand, a recent gift from Colton, caught the low light and threw 1,000 tiny daggers across the table. It wasn't an engagement ring, not yet. It was, in Colton's words, a promise. Colton reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "It's more real than anything, Cassie. This is authenticity. This is what I should have had all along." His voice was laced with the self-congratulatory sincerity of a man who has convinced himself that his selfish desires are a form of noble truth-seeking. For the past year, their affair had been a whirlwind of stolen weekends in the Hamptons, clandestine meetings in 5-star hotel suites, and breathless encounters in his private office after hours. Colton had felt reborn. He had told himself that his marriage to Gabriella had been over for years, a hollowed-out shell of obligation and shared history. Gabriella, in his mind, had become complacent, comfortable, more of a business partner from his early days than the woman he wanted by his side for the next chapter. He saw her as gentle, predictable, and lately preoccupied with her pregnancy, their first child, a miracle after years of trying. The irony was not lost on him, but he'd learned to compartmentalize it, to file it away under unfortunate timing. The baby was a complication, yes, but not a deterrent. He would be a good father, a great father from a distance. He would provide, of course. He was Colton Waverley. He was nothing if not generous. To us, Cassie whispered, raising her glass. Not yet. Colton said, a playful glint in his eye. He stood up, tapping his fork gently against his glass. A few heads turned. The low hum of the restaurant quieted slightly. Colton, used to commanding attention, fed on it. He didn't just want a private moment. He wanted to make a public declaration. It was his nature. He didn't just build a company. He built an empire. He didn't just have an affair. He orchestrated a coup of his own life. Friends, colleagues, he began, his voice resonating with the easy confidence of a man who has given countless keynote speeches. More heads turned now. People recognized him. Phones resting on tables suddenly seemed more prominent. Forgive the interruption. Most of you know me. For those who don't, my name is Colton Waverley. He paused for effect. Cassie looked up at him, her face a mask of pure adoration. This was it. This was the moment. She had been dreaming of the moment he chose her publicly. For too long, Colton continued, his voice dropping to a more intimate confessional tone. I have been living a life of compromise, a life dictated by expectation and history rather than by passion and truth. But life is too short to be lived in the shadows. He turned his gaze directly to Cassie, a warm, genuine smile spreading across his face. I am here tonight with a woman who has shown me what it means to be truly alive. A woman of unparalleled brilliance, passion, and vision. His hand gestured towards her. She is my future, so I would like to propose a toast. He raised his glass high. The room was now almost silent, a palpable mixture of curiosity and discomfort hanging in the air. The diners, mostly Wall Street sharks and society mavens, could smell blood in the water. This was better than theatre. To new beginnings, Colton declared, his voice booming. To authenticity. To the future. To Cassandra. A smattering of polite, uncertain applause broke out. Several people, business associates of Colton, felt obligated to raise their own glasses. Cassie's eyes welled with tears of joy. She felt like the heroine in a movie. It was at that precise cinematic moment that the grand oak doors of L'Étoile Filante swung open. The maitre d', a notoriously unflappable man named Jean-Pierre, rushed forward, his expression one of pure panic. But the figure who entered waved him away with a calm, dismissive gesture. It was Gabriella Waverley. If Colton's speech had quieted the room, Gabriella's arrival suffocated it. All sound, all movement seemed to cease. The air crackled with a tension so thick it was almost visible. Every eye in L'Étoile Filante swiveled from the spectacle at the center table to the woman standing silhouetted in the doorway. She was not what they expected. There were no tears streaming down her face, no hysterical rage. Gabriella Waverley was the picture of glacial composure. At 39, she retained the elegant bone structure and clear, intelligent eyes that had first captivated Colton 2 decades ago. She wore a simple, impeccably tailored navy blue dress that did not try to hide her body, but rather accommodate it. Her 7-month pregnant belly was prominent, a silent, powerful testament to the life she carried. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a severe, elegant chignon, and her expression was utterly terrifyingly serene. In her right hand, she carried a slim leather folio. In her left, nothing. She needed nothing else. Her presence was her weapon. She ignored the stunned maitre d' and the gaping patrons. Her gaze cut through the opulent room, past the crystal chandeliers and the obsequious waiters, and locked directly onto her husband. For a split second, Colton's face still flushed with the triumph of his toast registered confusion. He blinked, as if trying to reconcile the image of the docile, home-bound wife in his mind with the avenging angel standing before him. Then the confusion curdled into disbelief, and then into a flash of pure, unadulterated panic. His power broker smile vanished, replaced by the slack-jawed gape of a man who has just walked off a cliff he didn't see. Gabriella began to walk. Her pace was unhurried, deliberate. The click of her low heels on the marble floor was the only sound in the cavernous dining room. It was a metronome counting down the final seconds of Colton Waverley's world. She moved with an unnerving grace, a queen moving through a chessboard of her own design. People instinctively leaned away as she passed, as if her cold fury might be contagious. The soft glow of smartphones began to rise from the tables like fireflies, their lenses all pointed towards the unfolding drama. At Colton's table, Cassie Lang's triumphant fantasy shattered. The adoring look on her face melted into confusion, then dawning horror. She looked from Gabriella's implacable face to Colton's panicked one, and back again. The promise diamond on her finger suddenly felt like a cheap piece of glass. She was not the heroine of this story. She was the collateral damage. Gabriella reached the table and stopped. She did not look at Cassie. To acknowledge her would be to grant her a status she did not possess. In Gabriella's eyes, Cassie Lang simply did not exist. Her entire focus was on Colton. "Colton," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried across the silent room with the clarity of a breaking icicle. It was calm, level, and utterly devoid of the emotion he had expected. There was no pleading, no anger, just a chilling finality. Gabriella, he stammered, half rising from his chair. What are you doing here? This isn't the place." "Oh, I think it is," she replied, her eyes sweeping over the room, noting the raised phones, the wide-eyed onlookers. "In fact, I couldn't have picked a better one. You've provided so many witnesses." She placed the leather folio on the table. She didn't slide it or toss it. She placed it with surgical precision next to his plate of untouched oysters. "What is this?" Colton asked, his voice a low growl, a desperate attempt to regain some semblance of authority. "You should recognize it," Gabriella said. "You signed it. We both did. At your insistence, I might add. You were so worried about protecting your precious potential back then." She finally flickered her eyes towards Cassie for a brief, dismissive moment before returning to Colton. "It seems your potential has been fully realized. And so has this." She tapped a perfectly manicured finger on the folio. "It's our prenuptial agreement, darling." The word hung in the air electric. Cassie flinched as if struck. The prenup. The one thing she had asked Colton about. The one thing he had dismissed with a wave of his hand. "A formality, Cassie, from another lifetime. It means nothing." "I'm not sure you ever read the fine print," Gabriella continued, her voice as smooth as silk and as sharp as a razor. "Your lawyers were very good, but mine were better. I had them add a special section. Do you remember, Colton? We called it the infidelity clause, but it's so much more specific than that." She opened the folio to a bookmarked page revealing dense legal text. "Let me refresh your memory. I'll paraphrase so as not to bore your guest." Again, the slightest glance at Cassie, a masterclass in condescension. It states that in the event of marital infidelity, I am entitled to a standard, though generous, settlement. However, She paused, letting the word hang in the air, drawing every person in the room into her narrative. However, she repeated in the event of a public act of humiliation, defined herein as a declaration of an extramarital relationship in a public forum with at least 10 non-family witnesses present, the agreement shifts. Dramatically. Colton's face had gone from panicked to ashen. He knew. He suddenly remembered the negotiation, the clause he'd barely glanced at, dismissing it as Gabriella's little piece of melodrama, a bit of legal theatre to make her feel secure. A mistake. A catastrophic, world-ending mistake. Clause 7b. Gabriella said, her voice dropping to an almost conversational tone, though it lost none of its steel. The public humiliation proviso. It voids the standard settlement. It voids your protection of Ethereum dynamics as a separate premarital asset. It triggers a full 50% transfer of your personal net worth. And most importantly, it grants me 51% of your voting shares in the company, effective immediately upon confirmation of the breach. She smiled, then a thin, cold, triumphant smile that did not reach her eyes. So, Colton, thank you. Thank you for standing up tonight. Thank you for this lovely public and very, very expensive toast. You just made me the majority shareholder of your company. The silence that followed Gabriella's declaration was profound. It was the silence of a bomb detonating the moment after the flash, but before the shockwave hits. For a full 10 seconds, the only movement was the slight tremor in Colton Waverley's hand as he stared at the document on the table. Clause 7b. It sounded like something from a nightmare. The words 51% of your voting shares echoed in his mind, a death knell for the life he knew. Then the shockwave hit. A collective gasp swept through L'Etoile Filante. A woman at a nearby table audibly whispered, "Oh my God." The low hum of the restaurant returned, but it was different now, feverish, excited. The story was no longer just about a cheating husband. It was about a corporate assassination. The phones that had been subtly recording were now held aloft, brazenly capturing every nuance of Colton's collapse. Colton finally broke. The suave, charismatic tech titan vanished, replaced by a wounded, desperate man. "You're insane," he hissed, his voice trembling with rage. "This is a joke. You can't do this. I'm not doing anything." Colton, Gabriella replied, her tone infuriatingly reasonable. "You did this. The moment you stood up and tapped that glass, you signed over your empire. Every word you spoke was a nail in your own coffin. This is my company. I built it," he snarled, slamming his fist on the table. The champagne flutes jumped, and Cassie let out a small, startled cry. "I was there, remember?" Gabriella said, her voice still impossibly calm. "I was there in that garage, coding alongside you while you took all the credit. I was there when I cashed in my father's inheritance to fund your first prototype. My name isn't on the founder's plaque, but my fingerprints are all over the foundation, and now," she patted the folio, "my name is on the deed." Cassie, who had been frozen, finally found her voice. "Colton," she pleaded, looking at him with wide, terrified eyes. "Do something." He barely looked at her. She was an irrelevance, now the catalyst for his ruin. "Get out, Gabriella," he ordered, pointing a shaking finger towards the door. "Get out before I have you thrown out." A dry chuckle escaped Gabriella's lips. "Thrown out, darling. I could buy this entire building tomorrow morning and turn it into a daycare center if I felt like it. You are no longer in a position to give orders." As if on cue, a man who had been sitting quietly at a small table near the bar stood up and approached. He was in his late 50s, with a sharp suit, a sharper haircut, and the weary, patient eyes of a man who dealt with rich people's messes for a living. "Mr. Waverley," the man said, his voice calm and professional. "My name is Robert Peterson. I am Mrs. Waverley's legal counsel." Colton's head snapped towards him. "Peterson, Gabriella's lawyer." He was here. This wasn't a spontaneous, emotional outburst. This was a planned, strategic execution. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He hadn't been caught. He had been led into a trap. "Everything is in order." Mr. Peterson continued addressing Colton, but projecting for the benefit of the many recording devices. "We have multiple notarized affidavits from witnesses confirming the nature of your relationship with Ms. Lang. We have reservation details, travel itineraries. It's all very thorough." But honestly, he gestured around the room. All this is just icing on the cake. We have dozens of new witnesses now. Colton looked around at the sea of faces, the cold, glinting eyes of the phone cameras. He was trapped, utterly and completely. He sank back into his chair, defeated. The fight drained out of him, replaced by a cold, hollowing dread. It was Cassie who made the next move. The reality of her situation had finally crashed down upon her. She was not the future Mrs. Waverley. She was the Miss Lang mentioned in a legal takedown, the guest at the execution. Her career at Ethereum was over. Her reputation was in tatters. She looked at the man she thought was her savior, now a powerless, broken figure, and saw him for what he was, a fool who had gambled everything and lost, with a choked sob. She grabbed her purse, stood up, and stumbled away from the table. She didn't look back at Colton or Gabriella. She pushed her way through the gawking patrons, her face burning with a humiliation so profound it was almost physical, and fled the restaurant. The victor and the vanquished were left at the table. Gabriella watched Cassie go with an expression of supreme indifference. Then she turned her attention back to her husband, one last time. "The board will be receiving a notification from Mr. Peterson's office in the morning," she said softly. "I'd advise you to cooperate. It will be less messy." She didn't need to say anything more. She had won. She had taken back her power, her security, and the future of the company she had helped build, all for the sake of the child growing inside her. With a final lingering look at the man she had once loved, now just the rubble of a former life, Gabriella Waverley turned, with Mr. Peterson trailing respectfully behind her. She walked back towards the entrance, her posture erect, her head held high. The path cleared before her, as if she were royalty. The clicking of her heels on the marble floor was no longer a countdown. It was a victory march. As the doors swung shut behind her, a stunned silence fell over the room once more, before erupting into a cacophony of frantic whispers, the sound of a story so good, so brutal it would be told for years. Colton Waverley sat alone at his table, surrounded by the ruins of his grand toast, a millionaire in name, only staring at the prenup that had just become his eulogy. The public saw the confrontation at L'Étoile Filante as a masterpiece of spontaneous, righteous fury. They saw a pregnant woman pushed to her limit, finally snapping in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. It made for a compelling story, a simple narrative of betrayal and explosive revenge. But the truth was infinitely more complex and terrifyingly deliberate. Gabriella Waverley's arrival was not an act of passion. It was the final, flawless move in a chess game that had been playing out in the shadows for nearly a year. Colton had seen her as a predictable wife. He had forgotten she was by training and by nature an architect, a woman who understood that the most magnificent structures are built on invisible, meticulously planned foundations. His downfall was her secret masterpiece. The first hairline crack in her world had appeared 9 months earlier, not as a sound, but as a scent. Colton had come home late from a board dinner, leaning in to kiss her cheek. The fragrance that clung to the cashmere of his scarf was not her own. It was La Panthère by Cartier, an expensive, aggressive scent, memorable and distinct. Gabriella knew it instantly. She had been introduced to Cassie Lang at an executive reception months prior, and had noted the younger woman's perfume, filing it away as a piece of useless trivia. It was no longer useless. She said nothing, her mind quietly opening a new file, labeling it suspicion. From there, the data points began to accumulate. There were the late-night texts he would answer with a sudden, furtive energy, his back angled away from her in the dim light of their bedroom. There was the new, almost desperate focus on his appearance, the expensive personal trainers, the whiter teeth, the shift from bespoke suits to a slightly younger, more aggressive style. He even began to speak differently, peppering his language with Cassie's corporate buzzwords. One evening, discussing plans for the nursery, he'd called her design ideas, a legacy paradigm, but suggested they needed to growth hack the aesthetic for synergistic appeal. The alien words, spoken in his familiar voice, made Gabriella feel like a stranger in her own home. He wasn't just sleeping with another woman. He was absorbing her. Still, she held on to a sliver of plausible deniability. Until the night she sat down to reconcile their personal finances, a mundane monthly ritual that had become the bedrock of their shared life. With the first black and white ultrasound photo of their child propped against her monitor, a tiny flickering promise of a new beginning, she opened the statement for Colton's personal black Amex. And there it was. It wasn't a charge for a hotel or a secret flight. It was worse. Nestled between exorbitant restaurant bills was a single-line item from a boutique Soho jeweler, Céline Diamant. The amount was breathtaking enough for a down payment on an apartment. Gabriella's breath hitched. She Googled the jeweler. Their specialty was modern, extravagant diamond jewelry. The date of the purchase was seared into her memory, the day after their 7-week ultrasound, the day they had heard their baby's fluttering heartbeat together for the first time, the day he had held her, his eyes wet with tears, and told her this was the happiest he had ever been. The pain was a physical force, a white-hot agony that hollowed her out. The careful file of suspicions exploded into a certainty so brutal it almost brought her to her knees. This wasn't just an affair. This was a parallel life built on a foundation of lies laid during the most sacred moments of their own. She spent exactly 1 day grieving. She walked into the half-finished nursery with its cans of soft, gender-neutral yellow paint and the flat-packed birchwood crib leaning against the wall. And she wept. She cried for the trusting young woman she had been, for the 2 decades of partnership she now saw as a lie, and most fiercely for the innocent child who would be born into this wreckage. The room, once a symbol of hope, was now a monument to a broken promise. But as the sun rose on the 2nd day, the grief had begun to cool, to harden. It transmuted from a liquid sorrow into something solid and sharp resolve. She looked at her reflection, at the new roundness of her belly, and the woman staring back was not a victim. She was a protector. Colton was a threat not just to her heart, but to her child's security and legacy. That afternoon, she opened the large safe hidden behind a painting in their study. She entered the combination and retrieved a slim leather folio she hadn't touched in 20 years. The prenup. She remembered the negotiation vividly. A younger, more arrogant Colton, newly flush with his first round of funding, insisting on it to protect his company. And a younger, cannier Gabriella, sensing the latent narcissism in the man she loved, having her own shrewd lawyer, Morris Adler, draft a special addendum. Adler, a gravel-voiced bulldog of a man, had called it his mutually assured destruction clause. "Think of it as a fire extinguisher, my dear," he'd rumbled. "You hope you never need it, but you'll sleep better knowing it's there." Colton had laughed and signed it without a second thought. With the document in hand, she didn't call a divorce attorney. She booked an appointment with the most feared corporate litigator in New York, Robert Peterson. In his stark steel and glass office high above the city. She didn't cry. She presented her case. She opened a binder and laid out a color-coded timeline cross-referencing credit card statements with Colton's travel calendar and Cassie's social media posts. It was a mosaic of deceit assembled with cold architectural precision. Peterson, a man accustomed to emotional, chaotic clients, reviewed the binder and then Clause 7B of the prenup. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face. He leaned back, his eyes gleaming with professional admiration. "Mrs. Waverley," he said, his voice a low hum of respect. "Most people come into this office with tears and tissues. You've come in with a battle plan." Their alliance was forged. The first step was to hire Frank Miller, a discreet ex-NYPD private investigator. His brief was specific, not to prove the affair. Gabriella had already done that, but to map Colton's behavior, to understand his habits, his patterns, his ego. Frank's reports painted a clear picture. Colton was reckless, taking Cassie to the city's most visible, high-end spots. He was particularly fond of l'Étoile Filante, a stage where he could feel like the king of Manhattan. The final crucial piece of leverage fell into her lap during a lunch with an old friend, the anxious wife of an Ethereum board member. "Thank God the IPO is just around the corner," the friend fretted over her salad. "Richard is just so on edge. He says Colton has to be a saint for the next 6 months. The underwriters are so skittish. Any whiff of scandal and the whole thing could collapse." Gabriella's mind lit up. The IPO. It was the keystone of Colton's entire world. His ego was now a direct, quantifiable threat to his own wealth and the fortunes of his powerful investors. She now had a weapon that could not only win her a settlement, but could grant her absolute control. From that moment on, she and Peterson waited. They watched Frank Miller's reports, waiting for the perfect alignment of circumstances. The night finally came. A minor business triumph for Colton, a celebratory dinner reservation at l'Étoile Filante. It was the perfect stage for his hubris to perform its final act. Gabriella was at home, sitting in the quiet of the finished nursery, rocking gently in the glider, when her phone vibrated with a text from Peterson's assistant, who was dining alone at the restaurant's bar. The message was 5 simple, devastating words. "He's on his feet. The glass is tapping." A profound calm settled over her. The wait was over. She stood, walked to the mirror, and straightened the lines of her simple navy dress. She placed a hand over her belly, a silent promise to the life within. "This is for you," she whispered. Then she walked out the door. Not an avenging angel of wrath, but the cool, calculating architect of justice on her way to inspect the demolition she had so brilliantly designed. The fallout began before Gabriella's car had even reached the FDR drive. Inside l'Étoile Filante, The initial shockwave of the confrontation quickly sublimated into a frenzy of digital activity. The hushed reverence of the restaurant was replaced by the excited murmur of gossip and the furious tapping of thumbs on glass screens. Videos, shaky grainy, but utterly damning, were being uploaded, captioned and shared before Colton Waverley could even process what had happened. He sat paralyzed at his table, a solitary island in a sea of schadenfreude, the remnants of his celebratory dinner congealing on the plate before him like a metaphor for his life. By the time he stumbled out into the cool night air, the digital storm had already broken. His phone, left in his coat pocket, was vibrating incessantly, a frantic, buzzing harbinger of his social and professional execution. He glanced at the screen. Hundreds of notifications. Texts from friends, colleagues, and rivals, all variations of the same shocked question. What the hell happened? But it was the push notifications from news outlets that made his blood run cold. Tech mogul Colton Waverley. Humiliated by pregnant wife in restaurant showdown. The story was already out. The narrative was already set, and he was its villain. On the ride home in the sterile silence of his Maybach, he watched his life's work burn on the screen of his phone. The videos were everywhere. Toast of Shame was the #1 trend on Twitter, a brutal, mocking label for his grand declaration of love. Close behind it was #Prenup Power, a rallying cry celebrating his wife's strategic brilliance. He saw his face contorted in panic plastered across the internet. He saw Gabriella's serene, powerful visage hailed as an icon of righteous vengeance. He saw stills of Cassie's tear-streaked flight from the restaurant, captioned with cruel, dismissive jokes. He had wanted to make a public statement, and he had succeeded beyond his wildest nightmares. The emergency board meeting was convened for 7 a.m. the next morning. The atmosphere in the Ethereum boardroom, usually a space crackling with Colton's own brand of aggressive optimism, was now glacial. The air was thick with the stench of fear. Not fear of Colton, but fear of financial ruin. These were not his friends. They were his investors, and he had just lit a match in the powder keg of their biggest investment. Colton arrived looking like a ghost in a bespoke suit. He had showered and shaved, a desperate attempt to project a control he did not feel, but the sleepless night had carved dark hollows under his eyes, and his hands trembled slightly as he placed his briefcase on the table. He cleared his throat to speak, to try and spin the disaster as a private marital issue. But he never got the chance. Richard Davenport, the venture capitalist with a 9-figure stake in the company, spoke first. His voice was low and serrated with fury. "Don't, Colton. Don't you dare say a word about this being a private matter. Nothing about this is private." He leaned forward, his knuckles white as he gripped the table. "I spent my morning on the phone with my 19-year-old daughter, who wanted to know if the man she's babysitting her trust fund for is the same idiot she saw in a TikTok getting his soul filleted, set to a sad hamster song. So please enlighten us. Is that you?" The brutal assessment hung in the air. Another board member, a severe woman named Helena Vance, chimed in, her voice dripping with ice. "Our lead underwriter at Morgan Stanley called me at 6:15 this morning. His wife had already forwarded him 3 different articles. He wanted to know if the company's leadership was stable. What would you like me to tell him, Colton?" As if on cue, Colton's executive assistant entered, her face pale. "Mr. Davenport, it's David Chen from Morgan Stanley on line 1 for you. He said it's urgent." Davenport jabbed the speakerphone button on the console. "David, You're on with the full board." The banker's voice filled the room, stripped of all pleasantries. It was cold, clinical, and final. "Richard, gentlemen, we've seen the news, the videos, the documents that are apparently circulating. Given the extraordinary circumstances, we have no choice. The reputational damage is severe, and the question of leadership and share ownership is now unstable. Morgan Stanley is officially shelving the IPO. We're out. The offering is on indefinite hold." The click of the disconnected line was like the sound of a guillotine blade dropping. Billions of dollars in projected value had just evaporated. The room was silent, the board members staring at Colton with a uniform expression of cold fury. He had not just failed them, he had immolated them. Into this tomb-like silence walked Robert Peterson. He didn't knock. He entered as if he owned the place, which on behalf of his client, he now effectively did. He was the embodiment of Gabriella's flawless strategy, calm, prepared, and utterly merciless. "Gentlemen," Peterson began, his voice cutting through the tension. "A difficult morning." He placed his leather briefcase on the table and clicked it open, but didn't remove anything yet. "My client, Mrs. Gabriella Waverley. The majority shareholder of this company understands the gravity of the situation. She is, as you can imagine, deeply invested in the long-term stability and success of Ethereum. She has no desire for a protracted, messy, and public legal battle that would further erode shareholder value." He surveyed the faces around the table, letting the unspoken threat hang in the air. "Therefore, she has empowered me to present you with a solution. A clean break." From his briefcase, he produced a single crisp document and slid it to the center of the table. "This is a non-negotiable separation agreement. It stipulates Mr. Waverley's immediate resignation as CEO and chairman of the board. It further stipulates his acceptance of a discounted buyout of his remaining non-voting shares, a discount calculated based on the preliminary damages his actions have inflicted upon the company's valuation. It must be signed by noon today. If it is Mrs. Waverley is prepared to work with this board to salvage the company, and in time the IPO. If it is not..." He let the sentence trail off. He didn't need to finish it. Colton looked from the document to the faces of the men and women he had once commanded. He saw no support, no loyalty. He saw only pragmatic, ruthless calculation. He was no longer an asset. He was a liability to be excised. He had been surgically removed from his own life. With a hand that felt like it belonged to another man, he reached for a pen and signed his name, the scratch of the nib on the paper, the only sound in the room. While the king was being dethroned, the would-be queen was being erased. Cassie Lang woke up in her starkly modern apartment to a barrage of hateful messages on social media. Her frantic calls to Colton went to a voicemail that was perpetually full. At 9:15 a.m., an email with the subject line, "Notification of employment termination," arrived from Ethereum HR. It was brutally efficient. "This letter serves as formal notification that your employment is terminated effective immediately for gross misconduct and a violation of Section 12, subsection C of the Ethereum Code of Conduct regarding fraternization and conflicts of interest." Her corporate accounts were locked. Her career, which had seemed so meteoric, had vanished in a single keystroke. Desperate, she made one last gamble, calling a notorious celebrity journalist. She tried to frame herself as a naive young woman, manipulated by a powerful man. The journalist listened a bored silence on the other end of the line before cutting her off. "Listen, kid," he said, his tone devoid of sympathy. "No one cares about the mistress's side of the story when the wife is a pregnant Machiavellian genius who just pulled off a boardroom coup. She's the story. You're just the setup. Call me if you get a restraining order. Maybe then we'll have something." The click of his phone hanging up was the final confirmation of her irrelevance. She was collateral damage, a footnote, in the epic fall of Colton Waverley and the spectacular rise of his wife. A week later, Ethereum Dynamics issued a press release. It was a masterpiece of corporate damage control. It announced Colton Waverley's resignation to pursue other opportunities and the appointment of a respected industry veteran as interim CEO. The most crucial part came at the end. It announced the formation of a new Strategic Oversight Committee, created to guide the company through its next phase of growth and governance. The committee would be chaired by the company's new majority shareholder. The release was accompanied by a single, carefully selected photograph. It was Gabriella Waverley. She stood in the Ethereum boardroom, not smiling, but looking directly into the camera with an expression of calm confidence and steely resolve. She wore a simple, elegant dark dress. Her right hand rested gently protectively on her pregnant belly. The image was a declaration. It didn't just announce a new leader. It announced a new dynasty. The future was secure. The future was female. And the future belonged to her. 6 months later, the view from the 60th floor boardroom of Ethereum Dynamics was unchanged. But the soul of the company had been reborn. The frantic high-stakes pressure cooker that Colton had cultivated, fueled by ego, caffeine, and fear, had been replaced by an atmosphere of quiet, incisive focus. Meetings started onto. Agendas were followed. Voices were rarely raised, not because of intimidation, but because the sharpest point, not the loudest voice, now won the argument. At the head of the polished mahogany table sat Gabriella Waverley. She was not the CEO. She had wisely appointed a seasoned industry veteran for the operational grind. Her role was far more significant. As chairwoman of the Strategic Oversight Committee and uncontested majority shareholder, she was the gravitational center around which the company now orbited. Today, she was leading the final review of the IPO prospectus. The language in Section 4 regarding forward-looking statements feels optimistic. She stated her voice calm, but carrying an undeniable weight. She looked at Richard Davenport, the venture capitalist who had once snarled at Colton in this very room. "Richard, your team vetted this. Are we confident we can stand behind these projections without exposing ourselves to undue risk?" Davenport, a man known for his aggressive impatience, met her gaze with one of pure respect. "It's robust, Gabriella. We stress-tested the models against 3 different recession scenarios. They hold up. Your cost-cutting initiatives in the 3rd quarter gave us a much stronger foundation than we had under previous leadership." The name Colton went unspoken, a ghost of a less efficient, more chaotic era. Gabriella nodded, processing. "Good. Let's proceed." In the adjoining office, a space she had converted into a serene personal sanctuary, complete with a small, soundproofed sleeping nook, her 2-month-old son Leo stirred in his bassinet under the watchful eye of a trusted nanny. Gabriella's focus was absolute, but a part of her was always attuned to him. He was the anchor of her new world, the silent, vulnerable stakeholder for whom this entire corporate war had been waged. After the meeting concluded with a round of handshakes and genuine smiles of confidence, she walked into her office. The scent of baby powder mingled with the faint smell of old books and fresh coffee. She lifted Leo from his bassinet, his small, warm body molding against hers. As she looked out the window at the sprawling city below, a view she had earned back, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. The past year had been a crucible. The pain of Colton's betrayal had been real and deep, but from its ashes, She had forged a strength she hadn't known she possessed. This wasn't just revenge. It was a reclamation. She had reclaimed her past, secured her present, and built a fortress for her son's future. The contrast with Colton Waverley's reality could not have been more stark. He was a world away, sitting at a front-row table at the Café de Paris in Monte Carlo. The Mediterranean sun was warm, the air smelled of salt and money, and the harbour was filled with yachts the size of small hotels. It was a playground for the world's elite, a place he had once felt he belonged. Now he was just part of the scenery, a man with a famous past and no discernible future. His days had fallen into a listless routine. A late breakfast, a pointless stroll along the harbour, followed by hours spent at this cafe, nursing a single espresso hoping to be seen. He tried to network, to float ideas for new ventures, but his reputation had preceded him. He was the man who had been so blinded by arrogance that he'd publicly gifted his empire to his wife. No one trusted his judgment. Potential investors would listen with polite smiles, their eyes betraying a mixture of pity and contempt before making their excuses. He wasn't a phoenix. He was a cautionary tale. He pulled out his phone, a nervous habit, and began scrolling through a financial news app. And then he saw it. The headline was a dagger: Ethereum soars how Gabriella Waverley turned a scandal into a triumph on IPO day. He clicked, his heart pounding a sick, heavy rhythm against his ribs. The lead image was a high-definition photograph from the floor of the Nasdaq. There was Gabriella center frame, looking radiant and utterly in command. She wore a tailored suit of cobalt blue, her expression a perfect blend of confidence and grace. Her hand was on the podium, ready to ring the opening bell. Beside her stood the new CEO, and a beaming Richard Davenport, men who had once been his allies, now her loyal lieutenants. The ticker symbol for Ethereum, AETD, was displayed on the giant screen behind them, a green arrow pointing sharply upward. Colton zoomed in on her face. There were no traces of the quiet, accommodating woman he had taken for granted. This was a queen in her throne room. He had seen her as a chapter to be closed, a piece of his past, to be managed and discarded. He had never once imagined she would be the author of his entire epilogue. He scanned the article, the words blurring through a haze of impotent rage. Phrases leaped out at him: masterful turnaround, visionary new leadership, restored faith. The article praised her strategic mind, her quiet strength, her deep understanding of the company's core technology, an understanding he had always publicly claimed as his own. He finally lowered the phone, the screen reflecting his own haggard face. The toast. He remembered the feeling of that moment at L'Étoile Filante, the power, the sense of liberation, the triumph. He had raised a glass to his new beginning, and in a cruel cosmic irony, this was it. This hollow existence, this life on the sidelines, watching the world he built thrive under the hand of the woman he betrayed. This was the future he had so arrogantly toasted. His eulogy wasn't written in a legal document. It was written in that green upward-pointing arrow on the Nasdaq screen, a symbol of a future that was rocketing forward, leaving him forever behind. Colton Waverley, the visionary, had been completely and utterly erased. He signaled for the check paid in cash and walked away from the cafe, melting into the crowd of tourists and ghosts, a forgotten king in a kingdom that no longer knew his name. And so the empire built on one man's blinding ego was not destroyed, but reborn under the steady hand of one woman's strength. Gabriella Waverley's victory wasn't just about revenge, it was a reclamation. She didn't just take his money. She took back the narrative, rewriting the story of a foolish king with the legend of a brilliant queen. This story is a stunning masterclass in the two faces of power. Colton's was loud, flashy, and built on public perception, a house of cards waiting for a single gust of wind. Gabriella's power was the opposite, quiet, patient, structural, and rooted in the fine print he was too arrogant to read. He wanted to be the shooting star, dazzling everyone with his brilliance. But he forgot that shooting stars are just rocks burning up in the atmosphere. Gabriella was the ground beneath the foundation he stood on, and when he decided to leap, she simply refused to catch him. This brings us to the ultimate question. Was this a triumphant story of justice, a cold-hearted corporate takeover, or a tragedy for everyone involved? Could Colton have ever been redeemed, or was his downfall inevitable? And what about Cassie? A pawn in a game she didn't understand, or a willing participant in the betrayal? We want to hear your complex takes in the comments below. If stories of quiet strength, brilliant strategy, and incredible karmic justice are what you live for, make sure to hit that like button so we know to make more. Share this with anyone who appreciates a perfectly executed plan. And most importantly, subscribe and ring the bell, because the most powerful stories are often the ones whispered in the background, just waiting for their moment to take center stage.